Understanding Speaking in Tongues. Welcome to Faith Focus, the podcast where we explore the depths of faith, spirituality, and the journey of living a Catholic life. I'm your host, Daniela Bizant. Today we're diving into the fascinating and often misunderstood topic of speaking in tongues, also known as glossolalia. We'll explore what this practice means in the context of our faith and what scientific studies have uncovered about it. So let's get started. Speaking in tongues is a phenomenon where individuals speak in a language unknown to them, which is believed to be a gift of the Holy Spirit. This practice is rooted in the Bible, particularly in the Acts of the Apostles, where on the day of Pentecost, the apostles were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in different languages. People from various nations were able to understand them in their own tongues. This miraculous event showed the power of the Holy Spirit and the universality of the gospel message. Now, in the Catholic Church, speaking in tongues is recognized as one of the charismatic gifts of the Holy Spirit mentioned by St. Paul in his letters to the Corinthians. Paul describes it as a way for the Spirit to communicate directly through a person, often in a manner that transcends human understanding. He also emphasizes the need for interpretation to ensure that the message benefits the entire community. Personally, I have never experienced this. I have never spoken in tongues. I have witnessed it, often with a lot of skepticism, to be honest. And so this is a subject that definitely interests me. So we're going to start by reading from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 14, 27 and 28. If any speak in a tongue, let there be only 2 or 3 at most, and each in turn, and let someone interpret. But if there is no one to interpret, let each of them keep silent in a church and speak to himself and to God. This passage underscores the importance of order and clarity within the church. Often when I've seen this practice, I've seen many people all of a sudden get up and start, jibber-jabbering, and usually in a really public setting with a huge audience. And to me, that almost looks like, like you're trying to draw attention to yourself. Certainly goes against here where Paul says, at most 3 people, there you'll get a dozen. In some of these services, people get up and do this. So again, I approach all of this with a big dose of skepticism. But let's look at this through the lens of science, shall we? Various studies have been conducted to understand the nature of glossolalia, and they provide some intriguing insights. One notable study conducted by Newberg, Wintering, Morgan, and Waldman in 2006 used neuroimaging to observe the brain activity of individuals while they were speaking in tongues. The study found that the activity in the frontal lobes, the part of the brain responsible for self-control, significantly decreased. Meanwhile, areas associated with emotion and self-perception were active. This suggests that when people speak in tongues, they might be surrendering conscious control, allowing a more emotionally driven expression to take over. But linguistic analysis have also been conducted to determine whether glossolalia involves real languages. And these studies generally conclude that glossolalia lacks the structured grammar and syntax of natural language. Instead, it tends to consist of repetitive syllabic patterns that don't conform to any known linguistic rule. This has led some researchers to suggest that glossolalia is not a supernatural language at all, but a form of expressive behavior. Socio-cultural studies provide another layer of understanding. These studies highlight that glossolalia is heavily influenced by the cultural and religious context in which it occurs. The specific sounds and patterns of glossolalia can reflect the linguistic environment of the speaker, indicating again that the practice is shaped by the speaker's native language and cultural expectations, not the Holy Spirit. Despite these scientific insights, it's essential to recognize that for many believers, speaking in tongues is a deeply spiritual experience. It's a way to connect with God on a profound level, to feel the presence of the Holy Spirit, and to experience spiritual renewal. The Catholic Church acknowledges this, but it does encourage discernment to ensure that these experiences are really authentic and actually beneficial to the community. St. Paul's call for interpretation of tongues highlights the need for such experiences to build up the church. When someone speaks in tongues, an interpreter, guided by the Holy Spirit, translates the message into a language understood by the congregation. This process ensures that the message is coherent, meaningful, and edifying for everybody present. So let's read again from that first letter of Corinthians, chapter 14, section 12. So with yourselves, since you are eager for manifestations of the Spirit, strive to excel in building up the church. This passage reminds us that all spiritual gifts, including speaking in tongues, should ultimately serve the greater good of the community. But here's the issue I find, that often when these moments are happening, they're not at spiritually poignant moments like Pentecost, for example, but just anytime someone has an audience. And you're getting, like I said, 5, 6, 10, 12 people will get up and suddenly just start speaking jibber jabber, and nobody's there to interpret. Everybody's just getting themselves in an uproar, and everybody gets all excited and whatever, and then but nothing comes of it. And if we know the Holy Spirit, we know that the Holy Spirit isn't in the business of nothing. And the Holy Spirit also doesn't manifest just for fun, right? So there's always a purpose. So if someone's just getting up and speaking in tongues because that's what they like to do, that's not necessarily Holy Spirit driven. And sometimes I feel like it is a superficial expression of prayer that will keep us from actual prayer. Let me give you an example of that. I'm an artistic person. And, sometimes when I paint, I feel like I'm having a religious or spiritual experience, and maybe on some level I am. But there's many, many times where, I paint because I love to paint. And I could easily fool myself into believing that that moment of painting is prayer. And on some level, maybe it is. But until you get to the place of quiet where you're allowing yourself to listen, or you're really communicating in an intimate way with God, it would be easy for me to take an act I like to do, tell myself it's praying, and maybe enjoy the peace and quiet of it, but it not really be praying. I could be fooling myself. Because let's face it, prayer is a discipline, right? I have to not force myself to pray the rosary because I get a lot out of it, but there are some days I have to force myself to pray the rosary. And when I do the rosary, that's a prayer, right? That I had to sit down, made myself do it, and it was a discipline. Or if I'm having a deep moment of intimacy with God, because I either feel I need it, or I'm calling out to him, or I'm deeply full of gratitude, sometimes deeply full of a need of something, right? That would be deep prayer. And yes, you can make washing dishes prayerful if you want, of course, right? There's a lot to be said about doing physical activities in a prayerful way and as a meditation. Yeah, for sure. I'm not discounting any of that. What I'm saying is sometimes it's easy to trick yourself into believing you're praying by doing this big outwardly physical expression, but deep inside the quiet of your heart, are you really praying? And, the speaking in tongues can sort of be like that. Like, for example, if I'm sitting in prayer and all I'm saying is, please God, please God, please God, help me with this thing. Please God, please help me with this thing, even in English, right? Is that really a prayer? Because now I'm just repeating myself and probably potentially annoying. And the constant please, please, please also indicates slight lack of faith there. If I feel like I need to keep repeating myself, like God has a comprehension problem, right? So even then, I'm not fully in prayer. And all I'm saying is that you can do the same thing with speaking in tongues. So because you get yourself to, as the science proves, right, where you've taken your self-control out of the equation and you've allowed yourself to sort of freestyle whatever words or syllables come to mind, that's great. But is there an intimate message there? Because in that situation, you are doing the speaking, and if you're really doing the tongue thing as the Holy Spirit intends, it's not you speaking, it's the Holy Spirit. So when I hear people say to me, I pray in tongues, all you're doing is you're making up words or you're making up your own language, and that tells me that you don't have either your ask or your prayer clear in your heart, right? And I know that I don't always do, but when I don't have my prayer clear in my heart, I just won't use words, and I'll say, God, you know better than me what I need. I'm praying really for my stupidity in this moment. You tell me what I need. You know what's really in my heart. I probably don't even really know what's in my heart. You do. So whatever this is, this hot mess that I present to you, I give it to you in full. And then I will just stay quiet and just be grateful that there's a God listening in the first place, right? So there's the difference. So if you're just getting up there, standing up and whatever you're saying, papaya, jama, ba, 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 those are just sounds. And there's not a lot of real heart there. There's not a lot of meaning there. So I tend to be really, really, really skeptical of those that speak in tongues. If someone had said to me, I was alone or I was just with another person, and all of a sudden, I was speaking all these syllables I couldn't understand, but the person I was speaking to understood it, and there was no audience, there was no ego trip, there was nothing to be gained from that, I might give it more credence. But for people that get themselves worked up, for public accolades, or worked up for an audience, or worked up because it feeds their ego, but not necessarily getting them to a place of intimacy with God, I kind of set that aside. And also, if you are having the experience of speaking in tongues, you should be under the spiritual direction of a priest. That is one thing that is highly controlled. Someone that has that kind of charism should be under spiritual direction, very serious spiritual direction. Look, when you look at the historical times speaking in tongues have happened, they've been historically significant times, usually from a beatified saint, and it is incredibly rare. So if you're having this, I'm not saying that, saints don't exist in the world today and that you're not capable of that. We're all striving for sainthood, or at least we should be. But what I'm saying is be really, really careful, because the odds that Holy Spirit is using tongues to speak through you is really rare. So if you're having this experience, run to a priest and make sure that it's the real deal. And definitely don't be spreading it out on social media or doing it to a big audience, because then I could almost guarantee that's your ego talking and not actually the Holy Spirit. So that's just really, really important to take it and to not get potentially misled by someone just because, they must be holy because they're speaking in tongues. I would take that with a big, big grain of salt. Speaking in tongues is a complex phenomenon, and it blends the spiritual and the scientific. And while studies suggest that glossolalia may not involve real language and is influenced by the speaker's psychological and cultural background, it does remain a meaningful and spiritually significant practice for many believers, my skepticism aside. As Catholics, we're called to approach this gift with discernment, ensuring it contributes to the edification of the Church and aligns with our faith's teachings. So that's what I have to say on that. So thank you for joining me on this episode of Faith Focus. If you have any questions or thoughts on today's topic, feel free to reach out. Until next time, may your faith be strong and your spirit filled with the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Faith Focus is a podcast by FaithFocus.ca Catholic Inspired and hosted by Daniela Bezant. Subscribe and follow us for more insightful discussions on faith and spirituality. God bless.